The story opens with Shantian, an apparently ordinary boy whose childhood took a strange turn when his father placed a necklace around his neck, a pendant with a deep blue crystal that once belonged to his mother. His father embraced him tightly and murmured that the crystal held great power, a power he would someday need when life turned against him. Shantian, wide-eyed and curious, stared at the shimmering gem and asked about his mother, but when he turned back to his father for an answer, the man had vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint chill of mystery. 10 years later, Shantian woke up in a hospital bed. Every inch of his body was bandaged except for one hand, which he lifted weakly, as if expecting it to explain what had happened. His mind was blank, no memory, no clue. Before he could panic, a nurse walked in holding a tablet, her expression brightening the moment she saw him awake. She was stunning. So stunning, in fact, that Shantian's reaction was less than heroic. He let out a startled scream, and to his utter humiliation, his nose began to bleed. Smooth recovery, really. Flustered and babbling nonsense, he tried to speak, but all that came out was a jumble of stammers. The nurse, now equally startled and slightly annoyed, scolded him for yelling like a maniac. Shantian scratched his head, unsure if this was all a dream or a particularly weird afterlife scenario. Eventually, she calmed down enough to tell him not to move, that it was a miracle he was even alive. He blinked, confused, and asked what had happened. Her surprise was genuine. He truly didn't remember, so she told him he'd been rescued. That single word, rescued, triggered something. The memory rushed back. The yellow car, the terrified girl, and the split second when he'd thrown himself in front of her. His first thought was for the girl. Was she all right? Before the nurse could answer, the door opened, and an elegant woman entered, radiating money, perfume, and a hint of danger. She smiled politely and said her daughter was fine, even grateful, and offered a massive bouquet of flowers as thanks.
Shantian barely processed her words. He was too distracted by her presence, and naturally, his nose started bleeding again. She approached the bed, placed the flowers down, and asked what on earth was wrong with him. Shantian sighed, confessing that since the accident, he'd been having strange visions, ones that felt a little too real. The woman's pleasant demeanor vanished. With a voice sharp enough to cut glass, she told him not to even think about blackmailing her just because he saved her daughter. She was prepared to pay him well for his trouble. The accusation hit him like a slap. Shantian, still half bandaged and wholly offended, demanded to know why she thought he'd want money for doing the right thing. The woman's eyes narrowed, clearly convinced she'd met yet another opportunist. He, meanwhile, realized that whatever strange destiny his father's crystal had promised, it was only just beginning to show its teeth. With a cold, calculating stare, the woman asked if $1 million would suffice. Shantian said nothing. He simply looked at her, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. She took his silence as consent and sat down gracefully, crossing her legs with an elegant smile that screamed arrogance. Her next offer came just as casually, $2 million. That did it. Shantian's patience snapped like a string. He shot upright on the bed, shouting that he hadn't risked his life for money. The nurse rushed in, panicking, telling him not to move or his stitches would tear. But at the doorway, the woman barely flinched. Her voice was cool as ice as she tossed out one last bid, $5 million if that's what it took to buy his conscience. Still fuming, Shantian glared at her and declared that a person's life has no price. The words hung in the air like a slap. For once, the woman's polished mask cracked. Shock, maybe even shame flickered across her face. Shantian didn't wait to see more. He stormed out of the room, fists clenched, muttering under his breath about people who thought everything could be bought.
Down the sterile hallway, he almost missed the small figure standing at the end, a girl in hospital pajamas, her smile shy and uncertain. She asked if he was the one who had saved her. Shantian didn't answer. She giggled softly and thanked him anyway, her energy like a ray of sunshine cutting through his gloom. He muttered that there was nothing to thank him for. Anyone would have done the same. The nurse, lingering nearby, overheard and couldn't help but smile. To her, he looked even more heroic than before. Chantian, caught by her gaze, scratched the back of his neck and in a half-joking tone called her the pretty nurse. Then, with mock seriousness, he asked for a favor. Her cheeks turned bright red as she stammered, asking what he wanted. With a sheepish grin, he held out his hand and asked to borrow money for the trip home. The nurse blinked in disbelief. The same guy who just refused $5 million was now begging for train fare. Still, after an awkward pause, she fished a single 100-yen coin from her wallet, barely pocket change, and handed it over. Chantian thanked her sincerely, promising he'd repay her somehow. She said it wasn't necessary, but he insisted he'd find another way to return the kindness. With that, he pocketed the coin, flashed a grin, and bolted down the hallway like a kid escaping detention. The nurse watched him go, a little dazed, a little charmed. The girl waved cheerfully as he disappeared around the corner. Sometime later, Chantian arrived at a tall building in the heart of the city. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and pushed open the door to his apartment. A deep sigh escaped him. Finally, peace. The living room was silent, the TV dark, the air still. No one else was there. He headed toward his bedroom, the quiet suddenly interrupted by faint sounds coming from inside. When he opened the door and stopped at the threshold, his gaze landed on the half-open drawer, and whatever lay within made him freeze. At the bottom of the drawer, Chantian found a small velvet case, deep red, familiar, and unsettlingly out of place. The moment he saw it, a memory resurfaced, his father's voice calm but serious, saying that whenever his body began to change, he would need to wear the crystal. He opened the case slowly. Inside, the blue gem pulsed with light, alive and humming like it remembered him too. Chantian stared at it, mesmerized, until something strange stirred in his vision. The room seemed to blur, and suddenly he could see through things. His eyes widened.
So this was the power his father had mentioned. He slipped the necklace around his neck and whispered, almost reverently, that the time his father spoke of had finally come. Then the light exploded. A surge of blue energy filled the room, so bright it forced him to shut his eyes. A swirling vortex of energy erupted from the pendant, and before he could even gasp, it pulled him in. When his sight returned, he was no longer in his room. Instead, he saw, quite unfortunately, a girl in the shower, seen from behind, surrounded by mist and tile. His brain stalled for a full 3 seconds before the vortex spat him back out, landing him flat on the floor of his apartment. For a moment, he lay there, blinking at the ceiling, trying to decide whether he'd just teleported or gone insane. The crystal now lay beside him, dim and lifeless. Whatever it had done, it had drained itself. Chantian picked it up, frowning, when another odd sensation hit him. His body felt different, stronger. He unwrapped a bandage from his arm, curiosity outweighing fear. What he found nearly made him drop the cloth. His skin was covered in dark, shifting marks, like his body was melting and reforming all at once. The bandages he peeled off were shredded and riddled with holes, as if his very cells were rewriting themselves. He stared at his hands, terrified yet unable to look away. Everything, the light, the vision, the pain, it all tied back to the crystal. But before he could think further, movement caught his eye. From the other side of the apartment, a girl stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a blue towel, humming softly, and completely unaware she wasn't alone. The moment she saw him, she froze mid-step. Chantian, equally stunned, blinked at her like a deer in headlights. The silence lasted half a breath before she let out a strangled squeak and demanded, with furious embarrassment, what he was doing in her house. Worse still, Chantian's new ability was still active. He saw her as if the towel weren't there. He yelped, trying to avert his eyes, which only made everything worse. Just as panic reached its peak, another girl burst into the room, shouting questions and swinging before anyone could explain.
Her slap cracked through the air, leaving a bright red mark on his cheek. Chantian didn't even fight back. He just stood there, eyes shut, accepting his fate. Then a third voice chimed in, calmer, sympathetic, urging the furious girl to stop, saying he'd clearly learned his lesson. The aggressor huffed, crossed her arms, and demanded to know where Chantian had been for the past 2 days, since he hadn't answered a single call. Chantian, still dazed and reeling from interdimensional whiplash, blinked at her and asked, utterly serious,
what day it even was. The name Junia reached Shantian's ears, and everything clicked at once. The date, the confusion, the missing days. 2 days had passed since he'd vanished without a trace. The blonde girl standing nearby pointed it out sharply, accusing Junia of sneaking around to spy on her friend now that Shantian had suddenly reappeared. Shantian tried to improvise an excuse, but every word came out worse than the last. Junia, still wrapped tightly in her towel, flushed an even deeper shade of red. She knew he'd already seen her during that bizarre vision, and no amount of fabric could erase that awkward memory. The blonde, outraged, scolded him furiously, yelling that it was completely unacceptable to walk in on someone in the shower. When Shantian finally managed to leave the room, he muttered something under his breath about the house being full of weird relatives, which didn't help his case at all. The blonde, Inui, narrowed her eyes, clearly suspicious of him, while Junia's embarrassment turned into nervous tears. Later, needing to clear his head, Shantian headed to an empty sports field near his apartment. The place was quiet, the air cool, and the middle bars glistened under the afternoon sun. He grabbed one of the bars and began to work out, trying to shake off the day's chaos. That's when he noticed something strange. His movements were lighter, smoother. His muscles responded with ease, as though his body had been rebuilt overnight. He felt stronger, faster, undeniably changed. The crystal's power was still flowing through him. From a short distance away, an older man sat atop a large stone barrel, watching him intently. He pretended not to notice, focusing on his training, but the man eventually stood and walked over.
His tone was calm, yet there was a sharpness in his gaze. He complimented Chantian's physique and asked if he'd been in the military. Caught off guard, Chantian laughed awkwardly and said he was only 19. The man smiled knowingly, then suggested a friendly sparring match. Chantian dropped from the bar, waving his hands in refusal. The last thing he wanted was to brawl with a man old enough to be his grandfather. But the stranger didn't seem the least bit concerned. With a sudden, effortless motion, he stepped onto the edge of the stone barrel and delivered a kick that sent the massive thing flying several meters away. The thud echoed through the empty field. Chantian stared, wide-eyed, completely stunned. The old man smiled and asked teasingly what he thought now. In that instant, Chantian understood. This wasn't an ordinary man. He was a martial arts master. With newfound respect, Chantian bowed slightly and agreed to the challenge. Straightening up, he warned that he'd make the first move. Then, with renewed determination, he dashed forward, his left hand cutting through the air as he launched the opening strike, one that would test both his newfound power and his control. The old man smiled, calmly waiting for the right moment. When Chantian lunged, the man dodged with almost supernatural speed, grabbing the boy's arm and throwing him to the ground with no effort at all. The impact knocked the air out of Chantian's lungs, leaving him stunned by the man's strength. Kneeling on the ground, he realized that without the crystal's power, that single move could have seriously injured him. He looked up, and through the gem's faint energy, saw the old man's body glowing with a soft blue light. The master smiled and said it was his turn to attack. He began to move with deliberate grace, stepping across a circular mark on the ground, a yin-yang symbol surrounded by strange drawings, and showing flawless martial techniques. Chantian saw a brief opening and charged forward, hoping to surprise him, but the master blocked his strike effortlessly with an open palm. Still, Chantian seemed to know exactly where to aim. Each move targeted a weak point, something the master clearly noticed.
He defended carefully, yet grew intrigued by how this untrained boy fought with such uncanny precision, as if his eyes could see through him. With a sudden step forward, Chantian forced the old man to retreat, following up with a punch that passed so close to his chin it sent a chill down his spine. The master's composure cracked, irritation flickered in his eyes. Despite knowing Chantian had no formal training, the boy's blows kept landing where it mattered most. Realizing the match was slipping from his control, the master stepped back and raised his hand, signaling to stop. Breathing heavily, he rested his palms on his knees and asked for the boy's name. Chantian bowed respectfully, introduced himself, and thanked the master for the lesson. The old man nodded, clearly impressed. He told Chantian he was always welcome to visit his village, hidden in a nearby forest, and then pressed his fist into his open palm in a sign of respect. Chantian returned the gesture and thanked him again before leaving. The next day, Chantian went back to his private school near home. As he walked through the halls, he remembered that exams were just 12 days away and that he really needed to study. Lost in thought, he almost bumped into a dark-haired girl. To his surprise, it was Venjin, someone he already knew. She blushed and tried to greet him, but Chantian walked past her with a proud, distant look. Worried, she called after him, reminding him that everyone had been anxious about his sudden disappearance over the past 2 days. Chantian sat down at his desk, a faint smirk crossing his face. People didn't need to worry. He wasn't the type to give up on life that easily. Venjin frowned slightly, watching him from a distance, torn between relief and frustration. Deep down, she just didn't want to admit how much she'd missed him. Venjin tried to keep her distance from Chantian, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. In her world, wealth defined worth, and he didn't belong there. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open, and Saotsu came running in, carrying a large breakfast tray. With an embarrassed smile, she announced she'd brought croissants, sausages, and scrambled eggs. The girls brightened immediately and thanked her.
Jokingly, Saotsu remarked that she thought Chantian had done something drastic, like disappearing for good. Venjin frowned and told her not to say things like that. She added coldly that no girl in class liked Chantian anyway, so it was pointless for him to work so hard at his studies. That one stung. Before he could respond, another student, Chile, stepped forward to confront Saotsu, reminding her firmly that she was sitting in the wrong seat. The class, used to Chile's strict attitude, laughed and shrugged it off. A few even mocked her, saying that even with her 2 friends by her side, she wouldn't dare do anything about it. That's when Chantian spoke up, calling out Chile's name. To his surprise, she defended him, though she looked visibly annoyed about it. Grumbling, she said she hated getting into fights, but was helping only because they were classmates. Chantian, tired of the drama, shot back that this didn't give her the right to step on his foot. Chile froze for a moment, realizing he was right. Annoyed, she said she only wanted to protect him, but he calmly asked her to step back and lower her voice. Her face turned red with anger, and she threatened to end him right there. Her friends jumped in, equally irritated, saying they'd handle him themselves. Before things could spiral, the teacher entered the room, ordering everyone to sit down and announcing there be a mock test that day. Chile glared at Chantian from across the room, muttering that her bad mood was entirely his fault. Once the test began, 3 girls got up and walked out as if nothing was wrong. The teacher, clearly irritated, told them class had already started, but they ignored her completely. Chile, now serious, told her friends to stay put and warned that if they failed, they'd have to deal with the consequences themselves. The teacher, though clearly upset by their behavior, chose not to interfere. Chantian, on the other hand, felt a wave of relief. At least during the exam, no one would bother him. Moments later, the teacher placed a test paper on his desk, and to his surprise, the answers were already written there.
As Chantian stared at his test paper, glowing blue symbols began to appear before his eyes, as if the crystal itself were revealing the answers. He read each question carefully, his focus razor sharp, and within minutes, he had finished the entire exam. When he stood up to hand it in, the teacher frowned at his speed. "You can't possibly have answered everything properly," the teacher scolded. But Chantian calmly assured him that he had. Outside, Chill stood beneath the shade of a large tree, arms crossed, watching with her usual scowl. When class ended, her 2 friends ran to her, thrilled to announce they'd passed the mock test. Chill, however, didn't share their excitement. She glared at Chantian instead, demanding to know how he'd finished so fast. One of the girls joked that he must have just guessed every answer. Saotsu, always eager to stir trouble, walked over with 3 friends, mocking him for being lazy. One of the girls almost defended him until Chill cut in sharply, saying she'd only step in if he actually did something wrong. Laughing, Saotsu, her towering friend, sneered and told Chantian to forget about Venjin altogether. Then, with a flick of his finger, he signaled his buddies to attack, but Chantian was already prepared. He studied Salt Sum's movements closely, recalling the martial arts techniques his master had taught him. At the perfect moment, he mirrored the exact stance and landed a solid strike to Salt Sum's jaw. The blow was instant and decisive. Salt Sum flew backward and collapsed to the ground, unconscious before he even knew what hit him. The room fell silent.
Stunned, he pulled his hand back, insisting he didn't know any martial arts. But Shale refused to give up. She grabbed his hand again, eyes burning with determination. "Teach me," she demanded, voice shaking but firm. Shantian, visibly uneasy, asked her to let go, but she wouldn't. "I saw everything," she insisted. He took a nervous step back. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he had merely copied the moves of the old martial arts master he'd met before. Around them, a few students watched with envy, not just because Shantian had taken down an entire gang, but because he now had the attention of the most beautiful girl in school. Meanwhile, back in the village, the master who had once sparred with Shantian was about to have his meal when one of his aides entered, carrying a report. The master calmly asked for every detail. The assistant explained that he discovered Shantian's parents were dead and that the boy had inherited a pendant from them. He also mentioned that Shantian had refused a large sum of money after rescuing a girl. The master raised an eyebrow at that, then sighed and took a slow sip of tea. Apparently, the information about Shantian's parents was classified, guarded by some secret group, impossible to access. The master sat in silence for a while, realizing that this young man was far from ordinary. He then asked his assistant about the situation in the city's sand arena. The aide replied that they would still need someone to keep watch. The master stood and announced that he would be leaving the city for a while. He ordered his men to protect Shantian at all costs and to eliminate anyone who dared to harm him, but with caution, as the boy was sharp and might notice he was being watched. Even so, he made it clear they were to remain vigilant at all times. Elsewhere, in a hidden organization nested in one of the city's towers, a man known as Mr. Bat discussed Shantian's situation with his subordinates. One of them asked when they would begin the mission. The leader, composed and calculating, told them to keep observing for now. He wanted absolute certainty before taking any action. With his cold, glinting eyes, Mr. Bat commanded that Shantian be protected and that anyone attempting to harm him be swiftly erased. Moments later, he strode out of the building, his long cloak sweeping through the air before he vanished into the maze of city alleys. Completely unaware of the forces now circling around him, Shantian strolled leisurely through the city's commercial district. That peace didn't last long. Chile appeared again, running after him, still begging him to teach her how to fight. Growing impatient, Chentian said he only knew a few tricks, ones he planned to pass on someday to his wife and kids. Embarrassed, Chile blushed deeply and pleaded again to be accepted as his student. Chanthian, startled by her persistence, quickly clarified that he wasn't looking to adopt anyone. Her face turned even redder, and before she could stop herself, she blurted out that in that case, maybe she could just become his wife instead. Chanthian froze, his whole body trembling, eyes nearly popping out of his head in pure disbelief. Chanthian told her flat out that he'd never marry a girl like her, not someone who wasn't even pretty or had an interesting figure. Then he turned his back and walked away, leaving Chile standing there, offended but oddly resolute. Deep down, she caught herself wishing she could just be happy with who she was, but instead of backing down, she chased after him again, determination blazing in her eyes. He stayed firm, repeating that it would never happen. As they walked, they passed a small lottery stand. Chile's eyes lit up, and she eagerly grabbed a ticket, saying she wanted to test her luck. Chenthian, visibly annoyed, adjusted his shirt and snapped, asking what nonsense she was up to this time. He couldn't understand why a wealthy girl like her would even bother buying a lottery ticket. Child smiled and said it wasn't about the money, she just wanted to see how lucky she was. Before he could roll his eyes, she dashed to the counter. A man nearby was scraping the protective layer off his ticket when Child, excited, asked to buy a few as well. The man chuckled, saying kids like her knew nothing about lotteries and were just throwing money away. Chil's face turned red. She pretended to roll up her sleeves, clearly ready to prove him wrong. Before things got ugly, Chanthian stepped between them and calmly told the man to let her buy whatever she wanted. With a smug grin, he showed off his winning ticket worth 50 and said the boy could try too, but luck wasn't for everyone. Chanthian picked one deliberately, studying the pile, and within seconds revealed a prize of 800. Chile and the man both froze, mouths open. Chanthian quietly asked to exchange 700 for cash and use the rest to buy more tickets. Chile urged him to stop, but the vendor just laughed, saying plenty of fools spent their winnings hoping for another hit. Chanthian only smiled, his calm confidence almost irritating. One by one, he scratched the new tickets, and every single one was a winner, including one worth $2,000. The three of them stood there, completely stunned. As they walked away, Chile, still giddy, declared she wanted to learn his art of winning. Chanthian, glancing at the brand new phone he just bought, couldn't help but smirk, remembering how she'd also begged him to teach her martial arts. The girl, blushing, said both skills were equally important.
He ignored her teasing and called his cousin, saying this was his new number and asking where he should head that night. A yellow taxi rolled by, and Chanthian raised his hand, flagging it down with a look that said he already knew his luck wasn't done yet. Chile, realizing what he was doing, looked puzzled and asked where he was going. Chanthian climbed into the taxi and just before shutting the door, glanced back at her with a tired look. He told her to stop following him. Chile froze, speechless, watching as the car drove off and disappeared into the traffic. On the way, Chanthian told the driver to take him to the old street, the one lined with antique shops and stone-paved sidewalks. When they arrived, he stepped out and began walking slowly, hands in his pockets, mind wandering. He remembered Junia's request. She'd asked him to take a photo with her boyfriend as a birthday gift. He rubbed his chin, realizing the party was that same day, and figured he'd better find a decent present. As he wandered through the market, a well-dressed man appeared, escorted by 4 bodyguards. Every antique vendor along the street rushed to greet him. The guy was a famous collector after all. He responded politely to each one, his presence drawing everyone's attention. Meanwhile, Chanthian was scanning a shelf, his eyes lighting up at the variety of old treasures. Something about the place made him feel oddly thrilled. Maybe it was the idea that somewhere in that clutter, something truly powerful could be hiding. With his heightened senses, he could easily tell real from fake, and that alone made him grin. Then he spotted it, a gleaming green stone in a merchant's hand. The moment his eyes caught its glow, he knew that was exactly what he needed.
He rushed toward the counter so fast he nearly bumped into the distinguished collector. The bodyguards instantly tensed up, ready to block him, but Chanthian ignored their posturing and calmly asked the vendor for the price. The merchant held up the stone, claiming he'd sell it for 8,000, insisting he was giving the boy a fair deal based on trust. Chanthian turned the jade disc between his fingers, studying every line and shimmer, and quietly admitted he was just a student without that kind of money. The collector, watching from a distance, noticed how carefully the boy examined the artifact and decided to stay silent, curious to see what would happen next. The merchant, realizing the master's eyes were on him, started to sweat nervously, fearing exposure. Leaning forward, Chanthian whispered that he knew the piece was fake and worth no more than 2,000. The merchant pretended not to care, raising his voice and saying he wouldn't take less than 5. Wanting to end the exchange, Chanthian coolly pointed at a few other worthless stones on the counter and said he'd take them all for 5,000 flat. The merchant, thrilled by the bargain, even offered a fancy box to wrap the jade. Beaming from his small victory, he handed it over proudly. The antique master, who had been quietly watching the whole exchange, couldn't help but sigh once the boy left. He muttered that the kid still had a lot to learn. He had spotted the fake, sure, but still overpaid for it. In truth, that precious stone was barely worth a few hundred. Experience, after all, couldn't be learned overnight. Outside, Chanthian seemed unfazed. He gave a small, knowing smirk and flipped the jade disc into the air, catching it easily.
Then, in one smooth motion, under everyone's startled gaze, he turned his wrist and let the green stone drop. It hit the ground with a sharp crack, shattering into countless fragments. Gasps echoed around. The master's face went pale. He hadn't expected the boy to actually destroy it, but Shantian stayed perfectly calm, as if he'd just tossed a pebble aside. Su, the appraiser, found himself oddly impressed. The kid had read the scam perfectly and only paid what the fake deserved.
What truly intrigued Su was the way Shantian spoke earlier, confident but never arrogant. He realized then that the boy wasn't really after that piece of jade. Shantian's real interest was something else, a legendary yellow stone said to have surfaced after the death of a revered monk. Su recalled that most of his family's old treasures had been scattered or stolen long ago, all technically belonging now to his nephew. With a careful grin, he thought that perhaps this sharp-eyed young man could help him reclaim a few of those lost relics. He calmly asked Shantian to wait a moment. The boy stopped and turned, curious. Su proposed a small contest, a test of skill to determine who could better judge the true value of artifacts. Two nearby traders perked up immediately, whispering that this was turning into a real appraiser's duel. Shantian raised an eyebrow, amused, and made his own bold offer. If he won, he could buy whatever he wanted at his own price. But if he lost, he'd leave his life in the master's hands, his exact words. Su chuckled softly, impressed by the guts of this stranger, and asked whether the boy would agree to serve him should he lose. Shantian accepted the challenge without hesitation, his confidence practically radiating. Out in the street, a table was set up with an assortment of artifacts for the competition, and a curious crowd quickly gathered to watch. Su gestured toward Shantian, inviting him to choose a few items to appraise. The boy nodded coolly, declaring that if he got even one wrong, he would accept defeat without complaint. He picked out a Chinese vase, a necklace, a blue stone, and a small saucer, all while keeping that annoyingly calm composure. The audience murmured, half convinced the kid had lost his mind for challenging a master like Su so boldly. But Shantian wasn't bluffing. He was locked in and ready. His first choice was a small brown chest, delicately carved with floral patterns. He examined it for barely a moment before announcing that it was genuine. Su, intrigued, confirmed it, explaining that the chest once belonged to Empress Chi-Chi herself. Shantian smirked, then asked if he could
Prove the rest were fakes by, well, breaking them. A brief silence fell. Then Su, with a faint grin, agreed. He'd pay for any damage caused. Shantian liked that answer. Without hesitation, he tossed the first vase aside. It crashed to the ground, exploding into 1,000 shards. The crowd gasped, some clutching their chests as if they had just lost a fortune. Unbothered, Shantian crouched, picked up a surviving fragment, and held it up for everyone to see. On the underside, clear as day, was a red factory seal, the mark of a modern replica manufacturer. A wave of chatter rippled through the crowd. Even Su's fellow collectors were stunned, unable to fathom how the boy had spotted it so easily. Shantian just smiled, saying lightly that he had a knack for noticing the flaws others missed. Then he reached for the next piece, a supposedly ancient blue saucer. Also fake, he declared, before snapping it cleanly in two. Once again, Su had to admit defeat. There was no denying the evidence. Finally, Shantian picked up a jade bracelet. Su frowned. Of all the pieces, that one seemed the least valuable. Why waste his time on it? Shantian didn't answer. He studied it quietly, biting his fingertip as if lost in thought. Then, slipping the bracelet onto his wrist, he let a few drops of sweat fall on one of its beads. In an instant, the jade pulsed with a vivid red glow, a deep, living color that looked eerily like fresh blood, shining even brighter than sunlight. The crowd went silent, and for the first time, even Su's confident expression faltered. Something about that bracelet wasn't ordinary. Not at all. Everyone around was stunned by the phenomenon, whispering that the bracelet must be worth millions. A man stepped forward, eyes gleaming with greed,
and offered 2 million on the spot.
Chantian simply smirked and replied with quiet pride that the bracelet wasn't for sale. Master Su stood there speechless, watching the young man with a mix of admiration and disbelief. After that moment, even the great appraiser himself could barely recognize the same boy walking briskly down the old street. Just as Chantian was about to disappear from view, Su's calm voice called out behind him, asking him to wait. Chantian turned, curious. The master approached with his bodyguards and, after a thoughtful pause, admitted that he was impressed by the boy's talent. He offered his friendship, a rare gesture coming from someone of his stature. Chantian immediately understood the weight of that offer. He smiled, nodded, and accepted it with a polite thank you. Su, intrigued, then asked for the young man's name. Chantian, he replied simply. Before the master could say more, a tall man dressed entirely in black stepped out of a sleek black Lexus, flanked by several bodyguards. He had a tattoo under his left eye and earrings glinting from his ear and nose. The kind of man who didn't need to announce trouble, he carried it with him. His name was Asan. He looked directly at Chantian and said coldly that the boy was the same one who'd been beaten up before, the one they'd rescued from a dangerous group called Saltsu and rushed to the hospital afterward. At first, Chantian had been furious at those who attacked him, but things had only gotten worse since then. The memory of that day flashed quickly, the boy trembling in the bathroom, his father nearby, while guards and Dr. Lei waited anxiously outside. When they'd asked about the medical tests, the doctor said the results weren't ready yet, but confirmed that there were no drugs in the boy's system. Saltsu's assistant mentioned that he'd already known about the incident at school and had sent Asan to find Chantian, but the boy wasn't intimidated. He met their eyes, calm and defiant.
When Asan ordered him to come along, Chantian's patience snapped. He demanded to know who this man thought he was to give him orders. Master Su quickly intervened, warning Asan to mind his tone. He explained that Asan was his personal bodyguard and promised no harm would come to Chantian as long as no one interfered. Chantian was surprised to learn that Asan was actually related to Master Su, whose real name was Antikar. The tension grew thick. Asan declared that no one would touch Chantian while he was there. In response, Su's 4 guards stepped forward to protect their master. But Asan only laughed, and in the next instant, a surge of crimson energy erupted around him, a force so violent it hurled all 4 men away like ragdolls. It was the Crimson Whirlwind. There was no point in fighting back. Master Su tried to stop Asan, but the man just sneered and ordered his guards to throw Chantian into the car. 2 of them stepped forward, but before they could even touch him, Chantian moved with startling speed, grabbing both by the shoulders and hurling them aside. He stood firm, refusing to give in. Asan blinked, surprised by the boy's strength, and even Master Su couldn't believe what he was seeing. Chantian, his eyes cold, asked if Asan really wanted to test his strength. The man smirked, stepping closer. "You fight well," he admitted, "but you lack experience." The sun glinted off the earring on his ear, a small detail that caught Chantian's attention right before Asan's expression darkened. "What are you connecting to, boy?" Asan growled. Chantian raised a hand dismissively. "Enough talk. If you want to fight, stop wasting time." Asan chuckled, brushing his hair back. "Don't blame me when this gets ugly," he warned. Chantian knew there was no escaping this one.
If he wanted to walk away alive, he'd have to fight. Before either of them could make a move, however, shadows began to appear. Figures dressed in gray suits and masks, each marked with a crimson flame insignia. A voice came from behind, dripping with disdain. The new arrivals were from the unstable sands. Their leader stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Leave now," he said coldly. "We came for Chantian." Asan frowned. "Funny," he said. "I got the same order." The leader shook his head. "Then you know it's not up for discussion." Asan exhaled, clearly annoyed. He knew better than to pick a fight with that group of assassins. "Fine," he muttered, whistling mockingly. "You can have him today." Rage flared in him nonetheless. He struck one of his own guards out of sheer frustration. Chantian, confused and tense, couldn't understand why these people were fighting for him. 3 masked men approached, fists clenched, their presence radiating danger. Looking around, Shantian realized this situation was far more complicated than he'd thought. He took a cautious step back and demanded to know who they were. The leader's voice was cold as steel. "We want something that belonged to your father. Hand over the relic." Shantian froze. This was the first time anyone had ever mentioned his father owning such a thing. The man clarified, "A scroll. Bring it to us within a week, or you'll regret it." The boy's brows furrowed. A scroll? His father had never mentioned any scroll. How could he hand over something he didn't even know existed?
The leader's tone turned icy as he warned Chantian that he didn't care how the boy would find the scroll, or he'd suffer dearly. Furious and desperate, Chantian shouted back, demanding how he was supposed to find something no one even knew existed. Master Su, worried by the tension, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and gently asked what was going on, offering to help. Chantian forced a nervous laugh, brushing it off. "They've got the wrong guy," he said lightly, pretending nothing was wrong, but deep down, confusion and dread swirled in his chest. Meanwhile, across the city, laughter and the clinking of wine glasses filled a high-end restaurant where guests gathered for In-Sui's lavish birthday celebration. Music played, candles flickered, and the air buzzed with chatter. A young woman stood at the center, smiling brightly as she thanked everyone for coming. Just then, the room went silent. A man strode in, holding a massive bouquet of blue roses. People stepped aside instantly. Everyone knew who he was. Rich, powerful, and annoyingly proud of it. In-Sui tried to smile politely, though her mood darkened. Her cousin still hadn't arrived, and the man's presence only irritated her further. She brushed past him, and before anyone could react, a tall woman entered from the corridor, wearing a dark dress with gold embroidery. She apologized for being late, her gold earrings shimmering under the chandelier light. In her hands, she carried a brown chest, elegant, antique-looking. In-Sui's eyes widened, her breath catching as she realized it was a gift for her. The room filled with whispers. Everyone could tell it was something rare and expensive. Even Nan Lin, standing nearby, couldn't help but look impressed, though he comforted himself, thinking his gift would still outshine everyone else's. He stepped forward, asking the guests to accept his humble present. He offered the bouquet, within which sat a small ornate box. When In-Sui opened it, her heart dropped. Inside lay a gold ring. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the whispers turned to excited murmurs. Nan Lin's smirk deepened. The pressure from the crowd grew. People urged her to accept the romantic gesture. Her expression hardened. She had no intention of marrying such an arrogant man. Just as Nan Lin prepared to savor his victory, the restaurant doors swung open. Chantian entered, dressed simply, apologizing for being late.
Relief washed over In-Sui's face as she turned to him, her voice bright and full of joy. "You finally made it," she exclaimed. Grasping the young man by the elbow, the birthday girl smiled brightly and introduced him to the guests as her boyfriend. Nan Lin's face twisted with outrage. How dare this disheveled nobody show up and steal the spotlight? He sneered, mocking Chantian's plain clothes and lack of a fancy car. "So that's your boyfriend. Doesn't look like he owns much of anything," he taunted. In-Sui turned toward him, calm but firm, replying that you didn't need wealth to be with someone you truly cared about. Her words silenced part of the room and made Nan Lin's smirk falter. Chantian, curious, asked how she could be fine with not receiving a proper gift on her special day. Then, with a faint grin, he lifted a red glowing jade bracelet high above his head and declared that he had brought something special for her. Gasps rippled through the guests. In-Sui's eyes widened in surprise. She knew treasures like that were nearly impossible to find. Chantian turned to Nan Lin, his tone sharp and unapologetic. "This isn't some trinket you pick up in a jewelry store," he said. Nan Lin's jaw tightened, rage flickering in his eyes. In-Sui, flustered, whispered under her breath, asking where he'd gotten so much money. Chantian simply smiled and told her to be patient. Then, addressing the crowd, he announced that the bracelet was only part of the gift. He invited In-Sui to follow him. Together, they walked toward the restaurant's grand double doors. In-Sui blinked in confusion, unsure what her cousin was planning. Chantian smiled knowingly and offered to open the doors for her himself. She hesitated, murmuring that her room was supposed to be behind that door, but when it swung open, her breath caught in her throat. A flurry of crimson rose petals drifted through the air, spiraling slowly downward. The entire ceiling of the tall hall glowed with the scattered red petals. A dozen men dressed in black stood inside, applauding loudly and offering their congratulations.
Insui froze, overwhelmed by the spectacle. Chantian explained casually that he hadn't had enough space at home for a proper celebration, so he'd arranged everything right there in the building's grand hall. Then he gestured for her to look out the tall windows. Across the skyline, lights shimmered in perfect synchronicity, forming a glowing declaration of her name. Insui's cheeks flushed bright red as she realized what it meant. For a brief, dizzying moment, she wished his act of being her boyfriend wasn't just for show. She smiled shyly, trying to hide her face while her heart raced faster than she'd admit. But Chantian knew the entire spectacle had been orchestrated by his master, all to impress Insui. Meanwhile, Nan Lin was seething, trembling with barely contained rage. Right on schedule, a silver BMW pulled up to the restaurant to pick up Insui and a friend. The two young women climbed in and the car sped away. Insui turned to Master Su with a grateful smile, thanking him for the gift and admitting how stunned she was by the jade bracelet. The old man chuckled and explained that she probably didn't know much about antiques. That piece had been hidden among piles of worthless trinkets. She looked at the bracelet again, puzzled. Chantian had never claimed to be an expert in relics. He grinned and confessed that he'd actually found it by accident, tucked away in some alley. Just then, a gray minibus with tinted windows sped past them. Chantian's attention snapped toward it. The driver looked tense, almost paranoid. Activating his sharp vision, he saw something unsettling. A woman and a child locked in the cargo space, their silhouettes flickering under a strange X-ray scan. His gut twisted. Behind the van, another car followed stealthily. Someone was tailing them. Insui noticed his expression and asked what was going on. The girl sitting beside Chantian, his supposed girlfriend, stayed silent, eyes closed, almost as if meditating. Chantian quickly told the girls to get to safety and call the police. His voice was firm, urgent.
"That van's carrying Jen Ryu and her daughter," he said grimly. A flock of birds scattered overhead as the nervous driver swerved into an abandoned warehouse. The place was rusted and silent, the kind of spot bad things happened in movies. As the van's door swung open, several men shoved the woman and the child inside. Jen Ryu stumbled, fear flashing across her face. One of the thugs pushed her again, harder this time, making her crash to the floor and nearly crush her daughter beneath her. He barked out that he knew who was after them, that part of the company wanted the girl. The bald man in charge laughed, certain everything was under control. He grabbed the child by the wrist, trying to drag her away, while Jen Ryu screamed and clutched at her daughter's clothes. Another man yanked her back by the collar, and panic flooded her eyes. The little girl cried out for help, her voice echoing against the metal walls. Then, bathed in silver moonlight, Chantian appeared in the doorway of the warehouse, his silhouette sharp and unwavering. Chantian stepped forward, voice sharp and commanding, demanding they stop immediately. He warned them that the police were already on their way. The bald men turned, startled and angry, snapping at him to mind his own business. 3 of them tried to bolt, but Chantian was faster, his movements fluid, precise. He blocked their escape and countered each attack with almost insulting ease. Their leader, red with fury, pulled out a gun and snarled, "You won't leave here alive. This whole operation failed because of you." Then, a deafening gunshot shattered the silence. Jen Ryu froze, staring in horror as the young man's shirt darkened with blood. Chantian stumbled backward, clutching his stomach before collapsing to the ground. The woman burst into tears, shaken by his bravery. Even at the hospital later, she still couldn't comprehend how someone that badly wounded had fought with such strength. When Chantian first fell, Jen Ryu had screamed, terrified that everything was lost. The bald man laughed cruelly, saying it was his own fault, that no one should meddle in things they didn't understand. He stalked closer, taunting her, telling her to keep talking to herself now that her hero was gone.
But Shantian wasn't finished. Gritting his teeth through the pain, he slowly pushed himself off the floor. The thug raised his gun again, but before he could shoot, Shantian lunged, slamming into his shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. Zhenyu called out his name, panic breaking her voice, tears streaming down her face. Wounded but determined, Shantian pressed a hand to his stomach and urged her to run. "Get out, now," he said through clenched teeth. She tried to help him, insisting he needed an ambulance, but he refused. "No hospitals," he muttered, his voice strained. "They can't know about me. Come with me, to my place. It's safer." Later, behind the crumbling brick wall that surrounded his modest home, Shantian stumbled inside. He peeled off his blood-soaked shirt and tossed it aside without a second thought. From the table, he grabbed a small first aid kit. Scissors, bandages, antiseptic. With a grim expression, he began to extract the bullet himself. Zhenhu, who had followed him, rushed to his side, cleaning the wound and wrapping his chest carefully. She asked softly why he hadn't gone to the hospital. Shantian stared at the ceiling, his expression distant, almost haunted. He couldn't bring himself to admit it, that his body was changing, becoming something that couldn't be explained by any doctor. He shut his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. That's when Zhenhu noticed it. A strange light pulsing from inside his pocket, glowing brighter with every beat of his heart. While Shantian was distracted, Zhenhu quietly reached for the yellow stone glowing faintly in his hand. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the crystal flared, a blinding radiance pulsing through her palm. Heat seared her skin and she cried out, dropping it instinctively. The stone rolled across the floor and landed right on Shantian's wound. Instantly, a brilliant light flooded the room.
Zhenhu gasped as the bleeding stopped almost at once. She hurried to remove the bandage, only to freeze. The wound was gone. No scar, no trace of injury, nothing. Her hands trembled as she touched his skin, disbelief flickering in her eyes. Just then, a small voice came from behind her. A little girl, rubbing her eyes sleepily, asked how the young man was doing. Zhenfu Ryu gently stroked her daughter's hair, assuring her everything would be fine. A flash of intense light filled Shantian's vision. He jerked awake, startled, breath quick and uneven. Something inside him surged, a wild, uncontrollable energy that made every nerve burn. It was as if some hidden power had awakened, bursting through his veins. On the couch beside him, Zenryu sat close, holding the yellow crystal carefully in her hands. The bullet wound was completely gone. Shantian stared at the glowing stone, bewildered, realizing this small relic had just rewritten the limits of his reality. Without a word, he stood, silent and heavy with thought, grabbing a white shirt from the chair. As he buttoned it, memories flooded back. The day he found the blue crystal, the day he met the two masters. That was when everything started. He touched the spot where the wound used to be. No pain, just the faint hum of strange energy beneath his skin. His shirt buttons shifted on their own, and irritation flickered across his face. He knew, whatever that stone had done, it had marked him. Then, the front door slammed open. The same three members of the Unstable Sands stepped inside, shadows stretching across the floor. Their leader's tone dripped with disdain. "You haven't even started searching for the relic. This is your last chance, Shantian," he continued coldly. "You have until tonight to bring us the scroll, or you die." Shantian rubbed the back of his neck, exasperated.
"Scroll? I don't even know what you're talking about." The man's eyes narrowed. "Then you're lying, or too stupid to understand what you're up against." He took a step forward, menace in his every word. "Defy us, and you stand against the entire organization." Outside, the branches rustled. Another figure crouched above, a man dressed in shimmering silver, eyes locked on Shantian from the shadows. The assassins didn't wait any longer. With a single nod from their leader, they lunged toward him, blades flashing, intent to kill. The leader of the group lunged to the side with deceptive speed, his right hand slicing through the air in a blur. But Shantian had already seen it coming. His X-ray vision flickered to life, tracing every movement before it happened. He tilted his head just enough for the blow to miss by a breath. He knew the man's next move, a flip, and a vicious kick aimed straight for his skull. The moment the assassin twisted midair, Shantian raised his palm, calm and precise, catching the strike effortlessly. In one swift motion, he gripped the man's wrist and hurled him across the yard, the body crashing hard against a rusted fence. Kneeling, dazed, the assassin's eyes widened. He recognized the weapon the boy carried, and the way he moved. This wasn't just some random target. Shantian was trained, dangerous. The assassins tried to recover, preparing for another assault, but a heavy kitchen pot flew straight toward his head. He ducked, barely avoiding it. Shantian glanced back and saw Zhenhu standing in the doorway, gripping a metal rod like she meant business. Her voice trembled with anger and defiance. "Get out of here, now!" Shantian turned, his tone urgent. "This place isn't safe. You and your daughter need to leave, fast." But Zhenhu shook her head, flushed with determination. "You saved us. I'm not running and leaving you to die." He sighed, half annoyed, half impressed. "I didn't like you much at first, but after that, guess you're stuck fighting beside me." The assassin's leader snarled, glaring at his subordinates. "Enough of this. Move in and finish them." 3 of them charged forward, blades glinting. Just when it seemed Zhenhu would be overwhelmed, a shadow flashed between them. A tall figure with a sword that shimmered like liquid silver. The assassins froze. The newcomer moved lazily, almost bored, swinging his blade in a slow arc. 2 assassins collapsed before anyone could blink, their bodies hitting the ground with a dull thud. The leader's confidence shattered. His eyes widened. Yan Yuan?" Without glancing back, the swordsman said coldly, "Clean up your dead. They've wasted enough breath." He stepped closer to Shantian, studying him.
"So, your name's really Shantian?" The young man nodded warily. Yan's gaze softened, a strange recognition flickering there. "You fight like someone I used to know. Same resolve, same fire." Shantian frowned. "You knew my father, didn't you?" Yan Yuan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both pain and memory, more than you think. The swordsman, Siana, struck the blue crystal hanging from Shantian's neck with a sharp, deliberate blow. The pendant shattered instantly, fragments scattering like shards of light. His voice came out tight with irritation. "Why did your father create this thing?" Yan's tone, in contrast, was calm, almost too calm. "Because he forged it himself. The real relic was hidden inside all along." Shantian stared at the broken remains in disbelief. "Inside? That's impossible." "Then see for yourself," Yan said simply. The young man hesitated only a moment before gripping what was left to the pendant. With a faint crack, it crumbled completely in his hand. The swordsman, Siana, gasped, horrified to see the sacred pendant reduced to dust. But Yan's eyes gleamed. "Look again," he murmured. Shantian slowly opened his hand. Nestled among the fragments was a small, aged scroll, brown and faintly glowing. The air shifted. Yan stepped closer, recognizing it immediately. "The Phantom Sands," he whispered. He explained that Shantian's father had hidden the relic, pretending it was a keepsake from the boy's mother to keep it safe. The truth struck deep, stirring something raw inside the young man. "My father, he didn't want to be part of this, did he?" Shantian asked quietly. Yan nodded, his voice firm but not unkind. "He wanted you to live in peace." Shantian clenched his fists. "Peace? In a world like this, can anyone truly have that?" Yan's faint smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's why I'm here, to prepare you for what's coming." The weight of his words hit hard, but Shantian's resolve only grew. He bowed deeply to his new master. "Please, teach me." Yan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then start tomorrow. The entrance trials are close. You'll need every ounce of strength you can build." With that, the swordsman disappeared into the night. Zhenhu rushed over, helping Shantian to his feet. He felt the scroll's energy pulsing faintly in his pocket. Maybe with his vision and Yan's training, he could become something more. Someone who wouldn't be easily broken again. The next morning, school felt almost like a dream. Shantian tried to focus, but his mind drifted to relics, fights, and glowing stones. "Hey, you're late for the race," shouted Chile, running toward him. Shantian barely registered the words. "I'll pass. Train yourselves." Chile frowned. "I promised I'd teach you, remember?" Shantian covered his ears in mock annoyance. "Not happening." The girls nearby giggled, whispering between themselves. Chile's face turned crimson.
Your girls shouldn't dress like clowns, Chantian added flatly. Chile's jaw dropped. Laughter rippled through the courtyard as his friends tried to comfort him, but Chantian was already walking away, half amused, half impatient, with the world, with them, and maybe with himself. The way she dressed, Chile said, made her look like she was trying too hard, and that he only wanted to help her improve her image. The entire room froze.
No one dared to say a word. After classes ended, Chantian went to a cafe near the school where Insu had promised to wait for him. The warm smell of roasted beans filled the air as he stepped in. The cook waved cheerfully from behind the counter. Chantian smiled back and joined Insu at a corner table, both of them sipping beer like it was the most natural thing in the world. Moments later, Xiang Tian appeared, dragged a chair over, and sat right across from Insu. The girls around them exchanged curious glances. Junya whispered that she'd been scared of him yesterday, but the professor had stepped in and made everything less awkward. Shantian chuckled, saying Chantian should really call and thank the man. After all, he was the one who removed the steak from the table. Chantian laughed. "I already talked to him," he said casually. Then, taking a sip from his straw, he added that the professor had even offered him a job. In his head, he was thinking that Master Su was an influential man, someone worth keeping close. At that moment, his girlfriend suddenly snatched the cup out of his hand and shouted, "That's my drink!" loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. He quickly apologized, while Insu tried not to die of embarrassment. Then, regaining her composure, she leaned closer and said softly, "I need a favor." Her cheeks turned crimson as she lowered her gaze, clearly nervous. She explained that the art department's hotel was opening today and that their basketball team was short one player. Chantian blinked at her, surprised. He'd never played basketball in his life. Before he could answer, several people walked into the cafe, clapping him on the shoulder like they knew him. One of them mentioned that Insu had been asking around for help. Another man rolled a basketball in his palm, smirking. So, the art department couldn't even get Su to join, huh? The jab hit hard. Insu clenched her jaw, too furious to reply. But Chantian didn't even hesitate. He smiled, stood up, and said cheerfully, "Then I'll play." The stranger's grin faltered, and he stormed out of the cafe. But his friends didn't take it well. They began shouting, trying to provoke Chantian.
Once things quieted down, Insu leaned back and, half teasing, told him not to bring those kinds of people onto their team unless he wanted to lose before the game even started. Chantian smirked, but before he could respond, she slammed her hand on the table and said sharply, "Fine, let's make it a bet. If you win," she added, crossing her arms, "the loser has to call my big sister at every meeting from now on." Her challenge hung in the air, and Chantian, wearing that confident, irritating grin of his, simply nodded. Deal. She smiled slyly and said that Insu would be the one stuck with the call. The rivals locked eyes, sparks practically flying between them. Chantian took a small sip of his soda, wondering why these girls acted like boys whenever a bet was on the table. His fiancée, Su, blushed furiously when she realized he was getting dragged into another wager. Turning to the others, Chantian asked if he could bet on their teams too. The stranger raised an eyebrow and asked what exactly he wanted to bet. Chantian grinned, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "Simple. If I win, she has to call me her wonderful husband at every meeting." The girl gasped, face burning red, and kicked toward him, though catching him off guard was wishful thinking. Chantian dodged smoothly and caught her leg by the ankle before stepping back with a teasing smirk. Insu's patience snapped. She slapped her cousin's cheek in frustration, but the girl just straightened up, fire in her eyes. "Fine," she shot back. "If he loses, he'll have to run naked across the entire school." Everyone went silent for a beat. Then the stranger laughed, strutted toward the exit, and told his friends it was time to leave.
As soon as they were gone, Insu lunged at Kuzan with her fists, shouting that the girl was her worst enemy. Chantian barely managed to protect his head from the furious blows. Later, when the tournament time finally arrived, all the participants gathered at the sports field. The crowd roared as the basketball teams took their places. Insu muttered that she'd only use one first-level player. Chantian, still following her along the stone path, asked in surprise what she meant. She told him to wait, and a few minutes later, 2 new players appeared. A cheerful guy in a white shirt waved at them. "Hey, we've got reinforcements from other departments, Upon and Yui." As the match time approached, the stands began to fill with fans. The girls screamed out their idol's name, Muzin, in perfect rhythm. Insu frowned, recognizing the name, and asked if that guy was really on the opposing team. If so, that was trouble. Then a tall blonde appeared, grinning like he owned the place. His reputation was as shiny as his hair. People joked that he looked like a pop star, not a basketball player. The team captain grabbed him by the ear and dragged him toward the court, calling him Narcissus for good measure. Watching the chaos unfold, Chantian sighed. "Figures," he muttered.
The crowd gasped. Sean blushed so hard she nearly got a nosebleed. Realizing the scene she was causing, the girl quickly tugged down her skirt, flustered. Meanwhile, the opposing players dashed toward the hoop with sharp focus. Yupan shouted at his teammates to steal only from the other side, his tone frantic. Chantian decided to stay quiet, for now. Seconds after the whistle blew, the crowd favorite leapt effortlessly and scored the first basket. Cheers exploded from the stands. Fans were jumping, screaming, completely electrified. Everyone could tell who was going to win. Chantian clenched his jaw. That opponent was no amateur. It was going to be a rough match. The game pushed on. When Yupan got possession, an opposing player immediately closed in on him. The rest of the art department team scrambled, trying to block, but they were clearly outmatched. Yupan froze, scanning desperately for someone to pass to. His teammates' signals were a mess. Chantian caught his eye and motioned that he was open. Fan Li, however, gave a subtle mental warning. Now wasn't the time. But hesitation is deadly in basketball. When Yupan finally decided to throw the ball, it was already too late. Fan Li intercepted it with ease, dribbled past him, and dunked on the other side before anyone could react. Yupan stood frozen, confused and humiliated, still gripping the air where the ball used to be. Chantian stared at him, equally stunned, wondering why he hadn't passed sooner. The first half ended brutally. By the time the whistle blew, the scoreboard showed a humiliating 40-point lead for the opposing team. Fuming, Yupan shouted that he was done working with amateurs. He and Ensu stood up and stormed off the court. The remaining students awkwardly tried to defend themselves, saying they were glad to help, even if they'd never actually touched the ball.
Upin just scoffed, saying they could play however they wanted. He was finished wasting time on a hopeless match. As he walked off, Chantian's girlfriend grabbed Insu by the elbow and asked what they were supposed to do now. They couldn't continue without players. Insu took a sip of water, then smiled faintly. Maybe, she said, if 2 pretty girls asked nicely, he'd change his mind. But Chantian wasn't about to beg. Instead, he strode to the bench and called out, "You 2 from the art department, up." 2 timid guys slowly raised their hands, eyes wide with disbelief that he was serious. The young man smirked at Upin and said mockingly that he'd be the one to turn things around. 2 professional players had already failed to handle the situation, which only made Upin angrier. He shouted that it was impossible, that he'd rather bark like a dog than believe their team could win. The whistle blew for the second half. 5 players took their positions, while Chantian strode onto the court, confidence radiating from him. "Watch and see," Upin muttered to his friend, still fuming. Yansu rolled his eyes, betting that the kid wouldn't last 5 minutes. The opposing captain ordered Fan Li to keep scoring and reassured the girls that the art department's little miracle wouldn't last long. Then Chantian grabbed the ball. Fan Li stayed glued to him, blocking every angle, determined not to let him pass. Chantian, unfazed, took a few steps forward, then leapt high right in his own half of the court. The audience gasped. Was he seriously going to shoot from there? And yet, he did. The ball soared in a perfect arc across the entire court, the crowd's chatter fading into stunned silence as it sliced through the air. Swish! Straight through the hoop, without even brushing the rim. The stands erupted.
3 points. Just like that, Chantian raised one finger toward the sky, smirking. "That's only the beginning," he said. No one believed him, except maybe Inu and his girlfriend, who could barely process what they'd just seen. Chantian wasn't even supposed to play. He'd only been added to make up the numbers. But now, he was rewriting the entire match. He intercepted a pass, bounced the ball off his forehead with a cocky grin, and sprinted forward. Fan Li lunged, but Chantian was already gone, a blur of motion. Seconds later, he was under the opposing basket. The ball defender tried to block him, but Chantian moved faster than thought. He jumped, launched the ball midair, and scored clean. By the final whistle, the scoreboard told an unbelievable story. 111 points for Chantian's team. Fan Li hadn't scored a single one. The crowd went wild, chanting his name. Cameras flashed, fans screamed, the court shook with applause. Chantian had just given them a performance they never forget. Inu squeezed Ken's hand, eyes wide with admiration. Meanwhile, Upan stomped off, muttering that the guy just got lucky. Yui crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. "Whatever," she said coldly. "Let's just go." Chantian overheard the whole thing and couldn't help but smirk. Someone, after all, had promised to bark like a dog if things didn't go their way. The defeated team's captain was fuming. He shouted that Chantian's victory didn't count, that it was pure luck. Still, he swore he'd honor the bet if he truly lost. Puffing out his chest, he marched straight toward Chantian, yelling that he wasn't afraid of him and would keep his word. Deep down though, the captain couldn't hide his admiration. If he could convince this kid to play for his team, they'd be unstoppable. Then he remembered the actual terms of the bet. If he lost, he'd have to call Chantian my wonderful husband. Just thinking about it made him clench his fists in rage. Nearby, Chantian and Luca exchanged an amused glance. Intu teased that the girl probably wouldn't keep her end of the deal, which only made the captain angrier. He shouted again that he would, and the young men instinctively closed their eyes, bracing for the embarrassment to come. The girl yelled at Chantian, calling him crazy, and saying that addressing him as her husband would be humiliating. Chantian, completely lost, could only stare in confusion. Later that day, he returned to his old house, a quiet, elegant place that made his girlfriend's apartment seem small by comparison. As soon as he entered, he felt a strange calm fill his mind. Then, out of nowhere, a gentle breeze brushed past his cheek. He turned, and there stood Yenon. Chantian immediately bowed, showing deep respect for the great master. Yenon smiled faintly and said that Chantian's father had never spoken about martial arts, but now that his son was walking that same path, he would have the chance to learn everything his father once knew. From that moment, Yenon declared, Chantian would study 2 advanced techniques, the cloud steps and the sharp fingers. The young man's eyes widened. He'd only ever heard of such techniques in movies and martial arts dramas. They were legendary. Yenon, sensing his awe, nodded. Your father mastered the sharp fingers to perfection, he said calmly. Chantian's heart skipped. Then you know him? He asked eagerly. The master paused, his face unreadable. Not yet, he said at last.
Before you learn about him, you must first understand the inner art that drives both techniques. Chantian closed his eyes and focused, feeling every word sink deep into his mind. Yanin explained that both techniques relied on 8 foundational body forms, something that instantly sparked a memory. When he was a child, his father used to talk about those 8 forms all the time. Back then, Chantian thought it was just one of his father's eccentric ideas. Now he realized it had been training all along. Yanin praised Chantian for his knowledge and focus, saying the boy had remarkable potential, perhaps even enough to become a worthy successor to his father. After training, Inu decided to relax with some friends at a small cafe near school, glad that her class was in another room. The atmosphere was calm, until 2 guys approached and started bothering her. One of them got pushy, gripping her wrist hard enough to make her flinch. She struggled to pull away, demanding that he let her go. When she spotted Chantian emerging from the corner of the street, she immediately called out to him for help. He stopped and assessed the scene, his expression unreadable. Inu, growing impatient, snapped at him to do something already, her cheeks flushed with anger. With an infuriating smirk, Chantian said he'd help, but only if she agreed to be his girlfriend. Her face went from red to scarlet. "In your dreams," she shouted, wrenching her hand free just as the man with glasses stepped forward, ordering the thugs to back off. For a moment, Inu was safe, but then one of the troublemakers barked an order, telling everyone to stay exactly where they were. Chantian crossed his arms, amused. "You think you can handle this alone?" he said, tilting his head. "You'll need a whole team to stop me." That only made Inu angrier. "You'll never be my boyfriend, not in a million years," she yelled. He chuckled lightly.
"Then I'll just forget we had this chat," he said. "But don't be surprised if I bring it up next time." Before she could fire back, a bald, hulking man appeared behind Chantian. His voice was calm, but carried an edge. He claimed he didn't even know the girl, then politely offered Inu a drink, introducing himself and his friends. The group's fake courtesy did little to hide the danger in their eyes. With a cold glare, the bald man warned them all to leave, unless they preferred not to walk out alive. Inu froze. Was this seriously all happening because of her? Heart racing, she pulled out her phone and called her cousin, Chunchin. She wasn't even sure why she joined physical education classes in the first place, probably because that annoying swordsman insisted. When he picked up, she had barely time to explain before he hung up, muttering to himself, "Time to test the gear." Then, without another thought, he burst out of the house like a bullet. Using the cloud steps technique, his body moved so fast it blurred. He zipped past a silver car and overtook a yellow one with ease, leaving its driver staring wide-eyed at what looked like a ghost sprinting by. Moments later, Chunchin arrived at the cafe Inu had described. Silent, focused, and ready for trouble. Chunchin stormed toward the cafe, fists clenched and fury burning behind his calm eyes. Inside, Tander and his partner were still trying to reason with the students, urging them to leave peacefully, until one thug barked for them to shut up and stay out of it. Barilla, maintaining her composure, tried to diffuse the tension, but it was too late. One thug tore off his glasses, another grabbed someone by the collar. Their leader chuckled darkly, noting that the cafe's private room was so well soundproofed that no one would hear them scream. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing everyone in place. That's when Chunchin walked in, calmly, almost mockingly, holding 6 disassembled cameras in his hands. "Funny," he said with a smirk. "Looks like nobody's recording this little mess. Guess no one will see Barilla either."
The thugs turned, startled. Their boss, Xander, demanded to know how the kid had appeared out of nowhere. None of his men had even seen him approach. Then Shauna entered, her presence radiating a strange, fierce energy. Chantian's patience snapped. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's test the military gear right here." Xander sneered, motioning to his men, "Take him down." They rushed in, but Chantian didn't flinch. For a split second, he stood perfectly still, analyzing every angle. Then he struck. A single swing of his elbow dropped one opponent. A twist of his body floored another. By the time the rumble faded, the thugs were sprawled on the ground, groaning. His classmates stared in disbelief. He'd taken them all out before anyone could even blink. Xander's confidence crumbled. Trembling, he demanded to know who this guy was. When Chantian didn't answer, Xander lunged forward and grabbed him by the collar, a mocking grin on his face. Wrong move. Chantian glanced at the soundproof walls and said quietly, "No one's coming for you." Then he drove a brutal kick into Xander's chest. The man flew backward, crashed into the cafe door, and hit the floor with a strangled yell. Outside, the others could barely make out the muffled sounds of breaking furniture and something that might have been bones. The tension was suffocating. When the door finally creaked open, Chantian stepped out, steady but trembling, brushing dust from his shoulder. "Told you, I'm everywhere." The room behind him was wrecked. Tables overturned, chairs shattered, glass glinting on the floor. One thug lay there, bruised and bloodied beyond recognition. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. An ambulance pulled up, followed by police officers rushing inside. The crowd of students buzzed with shock, whispering whether those thugs were lucky to still be breathing. When they saw the officers detain Inu for questioning, Shantian stepped forward, telling them she'd been the victim, not part of the chaos. One officer, keeping his voice calm but firm, told the girl, "Please, miss, we just need your help to understand what happened." Shantian
Shantian gave the nervous student a reassuring smile and said calmly that everything would be fine, the case would be treated as self-defense. Inu started to argue, but one glance at the chaos around her was enough to remind her that this wasn't the time. Her cousin was already on a stretcher, being loaded into the ambulance, while the injured man outside was screaming for a lawyer, shouting that no one understood how dangerous that boy really was. Panicked, Inu grabbed her phone and called her mother. Her voice trembled as she explained what had happened. On the other end, her mother, dressed immaculately and speaking with quiet authority, said she was already aware of the situation. Crossing one leg over the other, she assured her daughter she'd handle everything, then immediately called Lord Sway, instructing him not to let anyone leave unless it was absolutely urgent. When she mentioned the issue involved Eon's son, the tone on the other end shifted. The couple promised to act swiftly and take care of it personally. After hanging up, Mata gently set the phone down and turned to the concerned parents sitting nearby. With a faint, polite smile, she said everything was under control and encouraged them to continue their discussion as if nothing had happened. Barely 30 minutes later, Shantian found himself climbing the steps of the police station. The pace of events had been dizzying. He knew full well that the thugs he'd beaten would try to press charges. Moving slowly through the quiet streets, he was still sorting through his thoughts when his phone buzzed. It was Mata.
Her voice was composed but urgent. She told him that a remarkable fighter would be appearing soon and that he should meet with her the following day. After hanging up, Shantian walked aimlessly for a while, wondering what reason his aunt might have for arranging such a meeting. By nightfall, neon lights bathed the city in color. As he strolled past a cafe, he caught sight of a girl whose beauty seemed to glow even brighter under the streetlights. Thinking the place looked inviting, he stepped inside and took a seat, idly flipping through the menu. Moments later, a girl in a red dress approached his table, calling out playfully, "Chantia?" He didn't respond right away, unsure if she meant him. Then her friend, a dark-haired girl in the tracksuit, joined her, smiling as she asked if they could sit with him. Chantian, amused and flattered, nodded with a soft grin, saying it would be an honor to share a meal with two such lovely ladies. Bimbim, sitting beside him, rolled his eyes in annoyance. "You don't have to flirt, just say yes." His girlfriend gently placed a hand on his hip, trying to calm him down before he embarrassed himself further. Shantian felt slightly thrown off by the situation, but when he looked more closely at the girl in the tracksuit, his expression turned serious. With unsettling certainty, he told her she was gravely ill. Bimbim slammed his hand on the table and warned him to calm down before someone accused him of harassment. Unbothered, Shantian calmly explained that the girl suffered from insomnia, mood swings, and, if nothing changed, probably wouldn't live past 30. The girl's face drained of color. "How do you know that?" she asked, stunned. Her friend lightly touched her elbow and muttered that it was more like 27. Then Bim blinked in confusion. 27? That was next year. The girl in the red dress snapped, calling the whole thing nonsense. She stood abruptly, saying she'd lost her appetite.
Bim Bim's girlfriend quickly tried to stop her, asking if there was any cure. With a faint smirk, Shantian said that if he revealed the treatment, Bim Bim would just end up punching him for it. At that moment, another girl approached their table, glancing curiously between them and asking what was going on. When she overheard that the sick girl would have to become Shantian's wife, the brunette flinched in disbelief. Realizing the tension, Shantian picked the girl up in his arms playfully, laughing awkwardly and saying it was all just a joke to lighten the mood. Before leaving, the two attractive girls placed a golden card on the table with their numbers printed in elegant script, promising to contact Bim Bim's girlfriend soon. Then, the girl in the red dress leaned in close to Shantian, brushed a soft kiss against his forehead, and whispered that they had an agreement. Without another word, she ran over to Bim Bim, asking him to wait for her. The young man stood frozen, baffled by her strange behavior. She kissed his forehead too, and walked away without even asking his name. The next day, Shantian arrived at Madame's office for the scheduled meeting. The place occupied one of the two tallest towers in the city. He had been so swamped that he had completely forgotten about it, and had to sprint there at the last minute. Panting, he burst through the door, apologizing for his delay, only to freeze mid-sentence. Sitting on the sofa were Bim Bim's parents, alongside a girl he recognized instantly. His expression turned to disbelief. Bim Bim looked over, equally stunned. "Shantian?" he called. Even the older man turned his head toward the door, curiosity flickering in his eyes. The curious girl tilted her head and remarked that it seemed like both young men were already familiar with the office. Bim Bim scoffed, crossing his arms with an air of disdain. Madame, narrowing her eyes, turned to her nephew and asked what exactly he'd done to the girl. Shantian blinked, taken aback, and quickly replied that he hadn't done anything. The woman smiled faintly.
"That's not the important part," she said, then turned to Bim Bim and pointing straight at Shantian, announced that he was her fiancé. Both young men shouted in disbelief at the same time. Bim Bim flushed bright red, while Shantian looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The girl stood abruptly, glaring at her supposed fiancé. She pointed an accusing finger and snapped that he didn't have any of the qualities she expected in a partner. Madame, raising a calming hand, clarified that it wasn't really her choice. The girl's family was simply going through a difficult time. Still confused, Shantian hesitated but ultimately agreed to his aunt's request. The girl's parents thanked Madame sincerely before leaving the office. Once outside the office, Shantian cornered his aunt, asking her to explain what that madness had been about. She simply waved it off, saying he just needed to pretend to be the girl's boyfriend for a while. The mayor's daughter had been stalking him again. Shantian frowned, saying he didn't know much about the mayor or his family. Madame gave a small, knowing smile. "Your mother is still alive," she revealed calmly. The words hit him like a thunderclap. Even Bim Bim's girlfriend, who'd overheard, looked stunned. Why had everyone hidden this from him? For years, Shantian had begged his aunt to tell him about his mother, but she always brushed him off, insisting it was better if he didn't know. Now, with a shadowed expression, Madame admitted that one day she might vanish, and when that happened, Insu would need someone to look after her. Shantian reached out in shock, asking what she meant by that, but Madame only shook her head and walked away, ending the conversation. The next day, he wandered through the streets of Angai, still replaying that cryptic talk in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more irritated he became. Why had he agreed so easily to her schemes? He finally got into his car, and just as he was about to drive off, Madame called out, asking for a small favor. He sighed and agreed without even thinking. That's when the commotion began. Behind him, someone shouted, "Catch that thief!" Shantian turned sharply and saw a man speeding away on an orange motorcycle, clutching a green bag ripped from a young woman's hands. The motorcyclist sped past Shantian, glancing back cautiously, but clearly not seeing him as a threat. Shantian clenched his fists, watching the man flee, thinking that he didn't look like a thief, more like someone venting his frustration on the world. Without hesitating, he took off after the bike, using his technique known as the Phantom Cloud Immortal Steps, which made him move so fast he could rival a sports car. The thief laughed as he rode, shouting that no one could possibly catch him. He was so sure of himself that he didn't even notice Shantian closing in. In the blink of an eye, the young man appeared beside the motorcycle. The thief's eyes went wide. How was this even possible? Before he could react, Shantian delivered a solid strike that sent him flying off the bike. The motorcycle skidded, lost control, and crashed spectacularly into the roadside. When the dust settled, it looked like a pile of twisted metal. The thief wasn't much better off, groaning on the ground several meters away after being thrown clear. Shantian retrieved the stolen green bag, muttering almost sarcastically that the man had really brought this on himself. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement to his left. Instinctively, he turned, just in time to block a high kick aimed straight at his face. He caught the attacker's ankle with lightning reflexes. The assailant froze, eyes blazing with anger, until recognition dawned. "You!" she exclaimed, shocked to see him there. It was Bim Bim, or rather, Lim Bim Bim, as she quickly corrected him with a scowl. Pulling out a shiny police badge, she declared in a loud, commanding voice that he was caught red-handed with stolen property.
Shantian blinked, realizing just how bad this looked. Awkwardly, he tried to explain that he wasn't the thief, but she wasn't having it. Just then, a woman came running toward them, by Ju, the owner of the stolen bag. Out of breath, she shouted that Shantian wasn't the culprit. She pointed at the injured man lying nearby and explained that he was the real thief.
Shantian handed the bag back to Baiju, who thanked him profusely. Bim Bim hesitated, clearly trying to piece everything together as the situation flipped on its head. Still doubtful, she marched over to the fallen man, badge in hand, ready to confirm the truth for herself. Shantian handed the bag back to Baiju, who thanked him with a warm smile. He returned the gesture, but before walking away, he said calmly that he wasn't quite done yet. Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a crisp red 100 yuan note and held it out to her. Baiju blinked, confused. "Why are you giving me money?" she asked, tilting her head. Shantian chuckled lightly and replied that he was simply returning the loan he'd taken from her back at the hospital a long time ago. The moment the words left his mouth, realization struck her. She gasped, recognizing him instantly. "It's you!" she exclaimed. He smiled, confirming it with a nod. Even the nurse standing nearby looked astonished, remembering the young man who had once turned down a 5 million yuan reward. Shantian gave her a look that said he vaguely remembered the money, but couldn't, for the life of him, recall her name. Baiju, still smiling, thanked him again and invited him to lunch as a way to repay his kindness, but Shantian declined politely, saying he had something urgent to take care of.
With that, he dashed off, leaving Bim Bim standing there, slightly dazed by everything that had just happened. The officer sighed, turning to the injured motorcyclist. She told him to stay put. She still needed to take the young man's statement, but when she turned back around, Shantian was already gone. Her jaw dropped. "That speed," she muttered under her breath. After handing the thief over to the local police, Bim Bim headed straight to the hotel where she had a scheduled meeting with Madame. She arrived slightly out of breath, apologized for the delay, and explained that she'd had to escort a criminal to the station. But when her eyes landed on the table, she froze. There sat Shantian, sipping orange juice through a straw like he owned the place. Fuming, she shouted across the room, demanding to know why he was there again, and why he always seemed to appear wherever she went. Shantian merely smirked, telling her she could at least try asking more politely. Madame stepped in before Bim Bim could explode. With a composed tone, she explained that they were both there for the same reason, to track down a level 3 assassin. Bim Bim's face flushed crimson. Stammering, she tried to excuse herself, claiming she was already on a mission with her fiancé, but Madame waved off the comment coolly, advising her not to pry into people or matters unrelated to the case. Then she handed a dossier to Shantian, reminding him that he had always wanted to learn more about his father's past. He opened the file, scanning the pages with sharp eyes, a mix of curiosity and unease settling over him. His aunt had been right all along. Ever since that cursed night when he lost his parents, he'd been obsessed with uncovering the truth. Later that evening, they wandered through the city, bathed in neon glow that made even the cracks on the pavement look dramatic. Bim Bim trailed right behind Shantian, her tone sharp as she warned him that failure wouldn't go unpunished.
He rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath that he was only there because someone had called him in. She snapped back, indignant, insisting she didn't need help from some clueless boy. But before her outrage could gain momentum, Shantian pointed toward a man loitering near the bar entrance and asked if she could guess which district he belonged to. The guy was tall, dressed far too well for a random night out. Bim Bim frowned, thinking maybe he worked at a bank or in some dull office job. Shantian chuckled softly and told her he looked more like a security guard. She almost laughed at the absurdity, since when did security guards wear tailored coats? But Shantian calmly explained that the man was a guard, just not stationed there. After all, he added, Bim Bim herself was dressed like a cop, even though she wasn't on duty. Right then, as if to prove him right, a man smoking nearby called to the well-dressed stranger and asked why he wasn't in uniform yet. The answer, he hadn't had time to change, hit her like a slap of irony. Bim Bim's jaw dropped. How on earth had Shantian guessed that? He shrugged it off, saying he'd merely paid attention to the man's posture and neatness. Trying to play it cool, she began scanning the parking lot. Details weren't really her thing, but she couldn't deny the guy had a point. Shantian, with a faint smirk, asked if she wanted to let go of his hand anytime soon. Flustered, she darted toward the club entrance, muttering something about how he might as well help her look for the target. They paused at the doorway, catching their breath before slipping inside. On stage, a local diva was belting out a hit tune, the crowd echoing every word like hypnotized parrots. Bim Bim stared at the sea of faces, overwhelmed, unsure where to even start. Shantian leaned closer and suggested they blend in.
So with no better plan, she mimicked a dancer, moving stiffly against his back. Chantian murmured that she should try looking less like a malfunctioning robot. He'd handle the rest. The girl awkwardly tried to follow his lead, though she was convinced it was pointless. She had no idea that Chantian's eyes could slice through shadows like blades, sharp enough to recognize faces even in pitch-black darkness.
After a few minutes of silent observation, he declared with absolute confidence that their man wasn't in the room. Bim Bim blinked in disbelief. That couldn't be right. The intel had come from the best agents on the force. Chantian only grinned, resting an arm casually over her shoulder as he suggested they wait a little longer. Maybe the info was good, but the suspect hadn't arrived yet. Her patience snapped. She smacked his arm and hissed for him to keep his hands to himself. Chantian raised both palms and mocked surrender while she crossed her arms, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. Then, his expression shifted. He pointed toward the corner and said he might have found their guy, the bartender. The man behind the counter was watching them with a mix of curiosity and caution. Chantian watched closely as the bartender lit a cigarette, the glow from the lighter briefly revealing his face. That split second was all Chantian needed. It was him. When the bartender brought the drink he'd ordered, Chantian thanked him politely, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. Bim Bim risked a glance and had to admit, the man really did resemble their suspect's profile. Still baffled, she asked how Chantian could be so sure. He explained calmly that people can tweak their looks, change hair, beard, even posture, but the tiny details never lie. A scar, the eyes, the way someone moves, it all betrays them eventually. Then, lowering his voice, he told her not to look back. The suspect was right behind her. Her pulse spiked, but she fought to act natural, pretending to sip her drink as the man sat at the bar, now only inches away, chatting idly with the bartender.
Without warning, Chantian grabbed her by the waist and pulled her close. Before she could even gasp, his lips were on hers. Her mind froze, completely blank. What the hell was he doing? He whispered against her lips, barely moving them. If she reacted, they'd blow their cover. Stay still, stay calm, don't ruin the disguise. So there they were, kissing in the middle of the room while their target lingered just a few steps away, pretending not to notice. The girl, heart hammering, mumbled under her breath, asking what they should do next. Maybe it was time to call in the higher-ups before things got even more complicated. The boy explained calmly that every member of that place had a kill order to fulfill, and if they didn't move fast, someone would end up dead. The girl asked if he planned to arrest the target right then. He said they at least had to try. Then, as if it were the most natural request in the world, he told her to kiss him again. Her cheeks burned as she stammered that this was her first kiss. Meanwhile, the bartender slipped a small package to the man at the counter, murmuring that it was for him. In exchange, the man ordered 2 special drinks for the couple seated just behind him. Chantian noticed Bim Bim drifting off in thought and told her sharply to cut the act. If she didn't, the target would notice something was off. She asked, still flustered, why he was so insistent about the kissing. But before he could answer, she suddenly marched toward the suspect with surprising determination. Realizing danger was about to explode, Chantian moved fast. He lunged forward, pulling her behind him as he knocked down anyone who tried to block their way. People hit the floor like dominoes at a drunken party. The girl could hardly believe her eyes, but the boy muttered that it was normal. After all, the man they were chasing belonged to a dangerous group known as Shifting Sand. Catching him wouldn't be easy.
Fuming, she demanded to know why he was talking to her like that and why he'd taken so long to act. He simply shrugged, saying he'd gone back to grab the phone he'd forgotten at the bar. Her frustration boiled over. What now? He told her not to worry, she'd see soon enough. Curious and still skeptical, she slipped on her glasses only to freeze as her surroundings lit up in a strange green glow. Night vision. She flushed, realizing her aunt must have prepared the gadget beforehand. The boy raised an eyebrow, asking how she planned to continue the chase looking like that. She'd already blown her cover once with her awkward behavior, and now those flashy glasses made her even more conspicuous. That's when a woman in a short skirt and a cigarette dangling from her lips blocked their path.
Chantian wasted no time. He offered to buy her wig and clothes, tossing 500 on the table like it was pocket change. The woman scoffed, clutching her hair and saying it was real. The boy smirked and said she didn't have to pretend. He was a man and he knew the difference. The woman's face twisted in indignation as the girl, utterly mortified, demanded to know what he thought he was talking about. Chantian replied dryly that fine, he'd only pay 100 for both the outfit and the hair. The boy didn't back down. He asked the woman if she wanted to sell or if he should just call the police. Terrified, she caved instantly, agreeing to sell everything at a discount. With the deal done, Chantian handed the bundle of clothes and the wig to Bim Bim, explaining that with this disguise, she could keep the surveillance going. She groaned that it was too expensive and absolutely humiliating, but he reminded her of her grand dream, to join the Special Operations Unit someday. That hit home. Eventually, with a mix of pride and irritation, she changed into the outfit. When she stepped out, Chantian couldn't hold back a laugh, declaring that she finally looked mission ready. Everyone else around seems equally amused.
He added, half serious, that if the mission failed, at least she'd have learned something valuable about humility. A moment later, he mentioned that the suspect had moved to a karaoke bar and they'd have to follow. She snapped, demanding how he could possibly know that. She was the only one with night vision dust. He smirked and said it was just professional instinct. He'd simply noticed where the suspect's eyes had drifted before leaving. In truth, he couldn't tell her the real reason. He didn't need any gadget to see in the dark. Soon, they reached the karaoke lounge, where cheerful staff greeted them at the reception. Chantian couldn't quite see through walls, but through the glass door, his vision picked up details far sharper than any normal person could manage. He watched carefully until something caught his eye, a small but crucial clue. He turned his head just in time to notice a young woman drop a photograph. A man stooped to pick it up, and she asked him something, but Chantian's attention was already locked on the image. His stomach tightened. It was Zine. He asked to see the picture more closely, and when he did, everything clicked. The target of the assassination was her. A nearby employee approached, quietly pointing toward a door on the left. That was her room. Bim Bim frowned, still confused, saying her night vision powder barely worked in that dim place. How had he found her? Chantian just said he'd managed anyway and that he needed to stay. He was going to settle this himself. He told her to leave and report everything they'd uncovered. She shouldn't come back for a while. She understood immediately and slipped out, already composing her report. Inside the spacious, softly lit room, she began calling her superiors, her voice fading as she moved farther away. By then, Chantian had already left.
He walked calmly through the hallway until something above caught his eye, a security camera tucked halfway behind a wall. Pretending not to notice, he crouched down as if to tie his sandal strap, then flicked a coin from his pocket with surgical precision. The coin flew straight into the camera's lens, shattering it with a clean crack. Just as he stood up, the girl came out of the room to thank him. She said she hoped they could work together again someday. He gave a faint smile, but before he could respond, a man stepped into view at the end of the hall. Chantian's tone turned wry as he greeted him. It seemed their paths crossed yet again. The man's face twisted with fury. He shouted, demanding to know who had let the boy inside. Chantian recognized him at once. One of the bartenders from the district's darker establishments, a man who definitely knew more than he pretended to. The bartender's hand twitched as he pulled out a gun, trying to conceal it under his coat. He stammered something about calling the police if Chantian didn't leave, but the boy didn't even flinch. Instead, he moved forward with deliberate calm, his steps so light they barely touched the floor, a technique known as the immortal steps of the wandering clouds. Before the man could react, Chantian's fingers struck his neck in 2 swift motions. Then in one smooth movement, he grabbed his head and sent him crashing down. As he held him there, Chantian couldn't help but think how much had changed. Not long ago, he'd been the one running from the lethal agents of shifting sand. But now, after everything his master had taught him, they were no longer a threat, just obstacles to be cleared. He noticed his necklaces glinting faintly under the hallway light. Inside, he found a hidden dagger, small, elegant, and wickedly sharp.
The blade gleamed cold in his hand. A fine weapon, he thought, too fine to leave behind.
At that moment, Beam Beam came rushing toward him, breathless, saying her aunt was on her way and they needed to get out before she arrived. She thanked him again, promising that once she made it into the Special Operations Unit, she'd repay him properly. They stepped out into the street, the cool night air washing over them. The girl waved goodbye, her smile lingering just long enough before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. She waved and walked away, her figure fading into the glow of the streetlights. Chantian watched for a moment, then turned to leave as well. Not long after, one of his comrades picked up a phone and called Senru. He warned her to stay alert. They had just uncovered the identity of the assassin targeting her. Senru's voice, shaken but steady, came through the line. She wanted to know where he was, but the man said they'd speak again soon once things settled. Chantian agreed, assuring her there would be time for that later. As he continued down the street, a commotion caught his attention. Two thugs were beating a boy who had curled up on the ground, covering his head with trembling hands. Chantian frowned, muttering to himself about how some problems were simply impossible to ignore, especially when the odds were 2 against 1. One of the thugs noticed him and barked a warning to stay out of it. Chantian was about to move on when the smaller boy suddenly fought back, lunging at his attacker and biting down hard on his hand. Blood streamed between his teeth as the man screamed, calling the kid a little pest and trying to shake him off. The other thug joined in, kicking the boy's shoulder brutally, but the kid didn't crumble. He had grit, raw and unpolished, the kind that caught Chantian's attention. With a sigh, he stepped in. In 2 swift motions, he sent both bullies flying in opposite directions. They hit the ground hard, groaning.
Chantian dusted off his hands and told them coldly to remember this lesson. Being stronger didn't give them the right to prey on the weak. The boy stood up, panting, and stretched out his hand in gratitude. He introduced himself as Gal and said he thought Chantian looked incredibly cool. Then, without missing a beat, he asked if Chantian would take him on as a student. Chantian raised a brow and asked what had started the fight in the first place. Gal hesitated, then confessed that he'd actually hit them first. They'd stolen his girlfriend. Chantian's expression turned almost amused. He asked whether the girl had been forced or if she'd gone willingly. Gal muttered that she'd gone on her own.
Chantian offered a business card and a warning. Training with him would be dangerous, and if Gal truly wanted in, he should call the number and claim to be his student. If the man on the line recognized him, ask for Master Sui. Gal lit up with excitement, clutching the card like a promise. A red car rolled up and Senru called the boy over. She sounded weary but determined, saying the older men were vicious and might even want her dead. Chantian told her they'd been hired by Shifting Sand to kill her, and she insisted she wouldn't give in. She planned to bankrupt those enemies in 3 days. She asked him to wait and not do anything illegal. She would dismantle their financial power herself. As they approached a large mansion, Senru smiled and handed him a set of keys, telling him this would be his house one day.
She pressed the keys into his hand because it would be a problem if enemies arrived and he couldn't get inside. Before he could process the generosity, a little girl barreled into the room, threw herself at him, and proclaimed him Big Brother, demanding a hug with a sweetness that dissolved even his guarded expression. The little girl complained that she was bored without him around. Senru told the child, Bama, that there was no more work for the day and she could go home. Bama thanked her with a grin, pushed open the door, then returned to Chantian to announce that his room was already ready and he should go to bed early. Chantian glanced at Senru, a faint flush rising to his cheeks, and told her she should rest too. The girl hopped over, begging to sleep beside her big brother. Senru tried to reason that he was tired and needed quiet, but the child's eyes soon filled with tears, an unrelenting, loud plea for company that made any argument pointless. She sobbed his name, insisting she wanted to sleep with her brother, Tiantian. Senru sighed, admitting defeat. There was no stopping the little one once she fixed her mind on something. The girl then demanded that her mother join them as well. Senru blushed, but eventually relented. So the 3 tucked themselves into Chantian's bed, crowded close with the child in the middle like a warm, insistent anchor.
Chantian had planned to use the night for training, silent practice while they slept, but the cramped arrangement ruined that idea entirely. He stared at the small, sleeping face beside him and then froze. A strange noise cut through the room. He stood up instantly. Senru roused too, asking what had happened. Chantian hushed her and fetched his dagger, blade glinting in his hand, ordering her to stay still while he investigated. He stepped into the corridor and followed the sound to Senru's own room.
For a moment, he thought that if he hadn't forced everyone to sleep together, the outcome could have been tragic. Approaching the door with careful stealth, he eased it open and peered inside, calling out that any intruder should stop hiding and come out. There was nowhere useful to hide from him. Behind a curtain, a man shifted into visibility, clutching a firearm in his left hand, wearing brown socks, and admitting with a stifled shame that he'd been unlucky to be discovered because he thought he'd hidden well enough. Chantian laughed softly, almost pitying the man's attempt. His vision was far too keen for such amateur concealment. The intruder, however, recovered enough to lift the weapon and pointed at Chantian, proclaiming that Chantian himself was the next target. The man sneered and asked if the boy wanted to speak his name before dying. Calmly, Chantian tightened his grip on the dagger and closed his eyes, preparing to answer. The stranger hesitated, then squinted as if trying to place him. Was he the son of Eon? Chantian's curiosity flared. He asked whether the man actually knew his father. The man admitted he did. He'd read about him in the Shifting Sand records. He went on. When Chantian's father was 20, he was famous across China, obedient, exemplary, and utterly unlike his son. Chantian demanded more, promising that if the man told the whole truth, he would let him live. The man laughed and questioned the bargain. Would Chantian really spare him, even if he handed over his father's celestial scroll? Chantian said yes, and invited the man to speak if the scroll existed. The man sobered and began to speak. There were 4 great masters in China: Dom, Ben, Nan, and Bin. Chantian's father, Shanlon, had been the master known as Venan. The man's next claim, that Chantian's father was dead, left the boy confused. The stranger insisted he didn't know about that and demanded the celestial scroll. Chantian tightened his cloak, then threw the scroll to the man. He stepped forward and, magnanimous for the moment, told the man he might leave, this time. Looking the man squarely in the eye, Chantian asked whether he'd come only to kill Senru. The man confirmed his assignment. Senru was the target.
Chantian offered one last strange mercy. The man could convince him not to kill him, using only 3 sentences. The man's grin went crooked. He suspected a trap and asked how speech could save him if Chantian meant to slay him anyway. Chantian began the test. The first sentence the man offered wasn't what Chantian wanted to hear. Chantian told him to keep his hand on his own throat and squeeze a little as he spoke. Pressure, the boy said, helps separate truth from bluff. The man winced and tightened his grip, teeth clenched. He tried again, claiming there were 8 celestial scrolls in existence, but Chantian shook his head, still not the right sentence. The man faltered and fell into thought, hunting for the 3 lines that might buy his life. The man hesitated, realizing too late that fighting wasn't the brightest idea. Sometimes walking away was the wiser move. But before he could act, Chantian pressed a precise point on his neck. The intruder's eyes rolled back, and he dropped like a sack of bricks. Chantian sighed, calling him an idiot. All he had to do was say he'd release Senru and beg forgiveness, then he could have walked out alive. Moments later, a girl entered the room and asked Chantian to read something for her. With casual calm, he replied, asking if she really thought he'd lose to that pathetic man. How else could he protect her? Senru, visibly shaken, rushed into his arms, taking him by surprise. He held her close, gently telling her not to be afraid, and suggesting she dress like the other girls. She wiped her tears, nodding, and said she'd boil water to cook for the guests. Before leaving, she asked softly whether he would always protect her. Chantian looked her in the eye and promised he'd never let harm come to her or to her sister Henru. Touched, Senru smiled through her tears and walked out. After she left, Chantian pulled his phone from his pocket. It was time to call someone who could finish what had been started here. When he and the girl stepped outside, his friends were already waiting. Gao waved eagerly, calling out to his teacher, thrilled to see him safe.
Chantian greeted his brother Su and the little one, Faju, teasing that they'd gone too far this time. Senior Hell urged everyone to come inside and sit down. Baby Faju piped up saying Brother Su trusted Chantian completely, so he had to keep doing his best. An older man, clearly someone of importance, remarked that Chantian was shaping up to be an exceptional martial artist. Chantian led them to the unconscious assassin on the floor, explaining that he was from the Unta San's organization. He asked that the man be delivered to the police along with a written statement. The elder promised to to handle it and informed Chantian of an upcoming competition in Lulin Village, one that would determine ownership of key properties. Chantian assured him he could be trusted with it. After their farewells, Chantian lingered, his thoughts circling the 8 celestial scrolls and the storm that might come if they were ever brought together. Just then, Crew noticed something off and asked why Tian looked frightened. The girl murmured that he'd been sleeping so deeply he hadn't even noticed what had happened while he dreamed. Zhenhao confessed that having him there made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in years. Loneliness had worn her down, but now, finally, she felt she had a home and someone she could trust. She thanked the boy once again for protecting her. Chantian pulled her closer, his hand gently lifting her chin. Her cheeks flushed pink as their embrace lingered, and then deepened into a kiss. Even Senerhel, watching from nearby, blushed faintly at the sight. When they stepped outside, a few young women whispered among themselves. "Look, that's Madame Zen," one said, eyes widening. "And who's that boy with her?" another asked, snickering. Judging by his clothes, probably her personal bodyguard, one concluded. Chantian, unaware of the gossip, was lost in his own thoughts. After that day, he had reached the 2nd level of celestial awakening, a milestone he hadn't expected to come so soon.
Back at the office, the doors swung open, and the boardroom filled with tense silence. The employees were already seated when one of the senior men sneered, asking why Madame Zen had brought a child and a pale stranger to a critical company meeting. "This is unacceptable," he snapped. Zhenhel's lips curved into a cool smile. "If his skin were as white as snow, he'd hardly be able to touch his toes." The man bristled. "This is a serious meeting. Who's going to take responsibility if that outsider causes trouble?" She turned to him with measured calm. "He's mine," she said simply, "and if anything goes wrong, I'll hold you personally responsible." The man called her shameless, muttering that she spoke too freely. Zhenhel arched an eyebrow. "Shameless?" she echoed. "Is that what you call people who survive the car crashes, kidnappings, and murder attempts you all planned?" She lifted her hand and tossed a thick stack of papers onto the table. The documents scattered across the polished wood. "Go ahead," she said coldly. "Read them." One by one, the executives leaned in, their expressions tightening as they skimmed the evidence. Sweat began to bead on their foreheads. Zhenhel crossed her arms, watching them squirm. "Those," she said sharply, "are the proofs you wanted." Murmurs spread like wildfire. One man tried to protest that the documents were fake, that she was fabricating everything to slander them. Another accused her of plotting to sell her shares at a discount to push them out of power. "You were not fit to be CEO anymore," one spat. Zhenhel's smirk didn't fade. She had seen this coming.
"If that's how you want to play," she said, voice calm but cutting, "then I'll use these documents to have every one of you prosecuted. The company shares will go to those who actually deserve to hold them. Trustworthy professionals, not corrupt cowards." The employees exchanged uneasy glances, too stunned to speak. Chantian noticed how sharp Zhenhel's mind was. Her decision was bold, but undeniably fair to everyone involved. Then suddenly, one of the men at the table stood up and jobbed a finger towards Chantian. "This is all his doing," he barked. "That pale-faced brat has been poisoning the Zen family's name." Zhenhel's expression hardened. Her gaze sliced through him like glass. "That's none of your business," she said coolly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Chantian stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with something dangerous. "So, if we were to take down those 5 old men," he asked, "everything would be solved, right?" "Chantian," Senru warned sharply, "don't act on impulse." He looked back at her, unbothered. "You can afford to wait, but the assassins from the Table Sands won't." The man's eyes widened as Chantian's hand shot up. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. A loud clack echoed through the room as Chantian's palm connected with his face. The man staggered back, clutching his cheek in disbelief. "Did you just hit me?" he sputtered. "What is this, some kind of joke? You want me to hit you back?" Chantian tilted his head, faintly amused. "Go ahead, if you think you can." Before the man could react, a voice called from the doorway. "Miss Sunru, the Vendente has arrived. You're needed to deliver the materials." Senru's eyes flickered with alarm. "The materials?" she murmured, glancing at Chantian. "Go."
"Bring them here." As Chantian turned to obey, the tension in the room thickened. The arrogant man from before shifted uneasily, his hand trembling. He looked at Chantian with an almost mocking smirk. "Do all your employees wear combat-grade leather boots?" he asked, his tone half joking, half afraid. Chantian didn't answer. His eyes narrowed as the man dropped the documents he'd been holding. The papers fluttered across the floor like scattered leaves. Then, with a swift, deliberate motion, the man pulled a gleaming knife from his belt. The room froze. The blade caught the light, cold, sharp, and deadly. The man lunged toward Madame Senru. She gasped and stumbled backward, eyes wide with fear, while Chantian's body tensed like a coiled spring. The attacker's knife slashed through the air, but Chantian was faster. He struck the man's wrist with a sharp, precise blow, forcing the blade to clatter against the floor with a harsh metallic ring. Before anyone could blink, Chantian was behind the assailant, his movement so fluid it was almost inhuman. The man froze, realizing his opponent had vanished and reappeared near the wall in a heartbeat. "You're fast. But tell me, do you have a bullet that's faster?" Chantian raised his hand and showed him a palm full of cartridges. "You mean these?" he said casually, letting the bullets spill between his fingers and fall to the ground with a dry clink. The man's smirk faltered. He hadn't even felt the gun being emptied. Without breaking eye contact, Chantian stepped forward, his body flowing with eerie precision. The air around him shifted, an echo of his technique, the immortal cloud steps. His movements became weightless, unpredictable, like mist in motion. He stopped just inches from the man, two fingers poised at the base of his throat. The assassin tensed, every muscle locked, aware that one wrong move would end him. "Who sent you?" Chantian asked coldly. "And tell me, was it really worth going this far?" The man didn't answer. His eyes darted around, searching for a way out. "This is your last chance," Chantian warned. "Surrender, or I'll make sure you regret it." The employee screamed, scattering toward the corners of the room. Just then, the door burst open, and a police officer stepped inside, gun drawn. "Who called the police?" he demanded. "I did," one of the men shouted, pointing to the would-be assassin. "He's armed." The officer scanned the chaos, then approached the group of shaken youths. "Who's in charge here?" Madame Zen raised her hand, her voice steady despite the tension. "I am." "Then you'll have to come with me for questioning," the officer said, holstering his weapon. Chantian frowned. "And what about the assassin?" "Backup's on the way," the officer replied briskly. "No one leaves until the investigation's over." Yang Tian, always the pragmatic one, nodded slightly. It was the standard protocol. Senior Hell turned to another officer who had just arrived and quietly explained, "There's a hidden entrance leading to the executive office behind this wall." One officer gestured toward a parked car outside. "That one's mine. Follow me." Meanwhile, Chantian had already ordered several men to guard every exit. The sound of boots echoed as another police team entered the room, sealing it off completely. No one would be slipping away this time. The tension in the air thickened as the supposed police reinforcements arrived. One officer barked an order, but Chantian narrowed his eyes, sensing that something was off. When the man repeated himself, the young warrior tilted his head and asked dryly, "You again?" "Funny. I could have sworn I've seen you before." The officer blinked. "What do you mean, again?" Before Chantian could answer, Shannon stepped in smoothly, saying it was just to confirm what her colleague had said. But the girl beside Chantian wasn't convinced. She eyed the man sharply and asked, "What reinforcements? You said you were first on scene." The so-called officer's composure faltered for half a second before he forced a grin. "Exactly. We were the first to arrive." Chantian's gaze darkened. "Then who are you really?" The woman, Madame Zen, opened the trunk of the patrol car, hesitating. "Isn't this the type of car used to transport criminals?" she asked, her tone cautious. The officer's smile stiffened. "Just get in, cooperate, and it'll all go smoothly." She froze, stepping back a little. "I said I'd cooperate," she murmured, "but I'm not driving that thing." The man's hand twitched toward his holster. "Sit down now." That was all Chantian needed to hear. His instincts screamed danger. He grabbed Zen's wrist and pulled her away just as the officer lunged. In an instant, they were outside, the cool night air slicing through the chaos. "Miss Semru," Shannon's voice rang out from behind, panic in every syllable. He had realized, too, this was an ambush. Above them, a faint glint flashed from the rooftop. Chantian's eyes snapped upward. A sniper. "Down!" he barked,
wrapping his arms around Zen and diving behind a nearby car as a shot cracked through the street. The bullet shattered the asphalt where they'd been standing moments before. Inside the building, one of the injured employees shouted, "Sniper! Everyone get to the shelter!" The supposed officers glanced around in confusion or pretended to. The real police, still arriving at the scene, exchanged bewildered looks. "What sniper? What's he talking about?" one of them muttered. Chantian didn't bother explaining. Still holding Zen close, he whispered, "The assassins from Tabalsandis won't stop. They've sent 2 already. You're not safe yet." The girl trembled against him, but he tightened his hold. The danger hadn't passed. It had just gone underground. By morning, the world seemed deceptively calm. The sun stretched across a clear blue sky, the kind lied about the night before. In the schoolyard, laughter replaced the sound of gunfire. The boys were playing basketball. One sprinted toward the hoop, leapt, and nailed a perfect shot. From the sidelines, a few girls chatted, half watching, half daydreaming. "We've got a ton of work ahead," one said, sighing. Chantian sat apart, lost in thought. His mind wasn't on the game, it was on her. Protecting Zen meant crossing paths again with the assassins who wouldn't rest until their mission was done. He glanced toward the bleachers and spotted a figure in a black hoodie, sitting alone, head bowed. Something in his gut twisted. Maybe the night's shadow wasn't gone after all.